exciting webinars. And today we have with us Dr. V.R. Lalitambika, ma'am, who is a distinguished scientist and director at the Directorate of Human Space Program at ISRO to take us through our webinar on space exploration, challenges and opportunities. We are really honored to have Lalitambika ma'am with us, and I would like to wholeheartedly welcome her to this virtual gathering. I would also like to welcome Shanti Ravindran ma'am and of Motorola Solutions, Singapore Private Limited, and Professor Dr. B.S. Manoj of IEEE EMBS. I would also like to welcome our MCs for the day and also all the attendees of today's meet. Now, human space exploration is vital to our space programs and the science community as well. And today, the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO's success, it has made India to be inducted in an elite group of countries where India is rightfully acknowledged as a space power in the world. And so are the opportunities and challenges that space exploration can possibly have. And it is really an honor for us to have Lalitambika ma'am with us, that too from ISRO, to talk to us on this much essential topic. And so, ma'am, we are really waiting to hear from you. And once again, welcoming all of you to today's evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Fida. May I request Dr. Shanti Ravindran, Principal Architect, Motorola Solutions, Singapore Private Limited, to introduce the speaker.
Hi, thank you for the privilege and pleasure to invite Ambika to make this speech. I'm actually more tense making this introduction than when I made my speech itself. But I grew up together with Ambika from young age. We were neighbors in Trivandrum. We fought together, we played together, and it's a great pleasure to welcome her to this session. I won't go into her achievements. We know that well from her resume. She has received many awards, but I was very happy to see that she has also mentored so many students and transferred her knowledge and experience to them in the process, I'm sure. When we were growing up and we were in college, we know that we knew that she would go places because she was very smart even in those days. But I want to introduce her as a person. What impressed me all these days is the humility that she still holds in spite of being in such a preeminent position. She's always there with us in our WhatsApp groups and our trips, sharing our challenges, celebrating our little successes as a very good friend, lending a hand to us. And that humility really impresses me, considering that she has achieved so much and managed to bring up a very good, smart family in the process. And as a woman, that I believe is a great achievement. The other quality that always impressed me about Ambika is that she has this childlike innocence and curiosity about things. At least I have not interacted with her personally, professionally, but I have always observed that this curiosity and innocence is very, very charming, and I believe that will lead her to do many more things in the future. With that, I will invite her to make her a presentation. One tidbit I will give you. We know her as a cat woman because wherever Ambika is, there will be always some putties around. I'm sure they were there around in the SSC also somewhere. So with that, I will invite Ambika to make the speech. Ambika, we are all listening, waiting to listen to you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Shanti. It's a very unique experience for me to be introduced by a friend who knows me in and out, right from childhood. For your information, I have a cat here also. Okay. Good evening to you all. It is really my pleasure and privilege to participate in this webinar series. I hope I am audible. Shanti?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm really impressed to see that you have, this is the 48th program, and I'm seeing the next ones lined up as well. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. So I will briefly highlight the different challenges, and of course, with each challenge, there comes an opportunity in the domain in which I have been working all along, that is the space exploration. I'll start sharing my content now. Just a moment. So I hope this is fully visible to you.
Yes.
Okay. So I thought we'll just start by taking stock of where we are. Okay. So the first line is where we are with respect to manned space exploration. And the second line is where we are with respect to manned space exploration. As we all know, we have really gone far beyond the solar system, and the voyagers are now deep in interstellar space. Of course, before the voyagers, the pioneers also went. Now, if you see where we are with respect to manned space exploration, we can see that we have always limited ourselves to the vicinity of the Earth. Of course, we did go to the moon, but then we came back and settled in Leo. A lot of very good science has happened in the low Earth orbit with respect to the microgravity experiments, and a lot of spin-off benefits for us here on Earth. And we all know the thrust that is currently there on having a human set foot on Mars. But the reality remains that we are still bound to the surroundings of the Earth. So this is because of the inherent challenges. There are technical challenges and also the human related challenges, which also throws open a wide variety of potential research areas. So I will go to the next slide. So I thought before I go into the challenges, I should give a brief outline of the various systems that are involved in a typical space transportation system. So when we talk about a space transportation system, there are two parts, of course. There is the ascent vehicle, and then there is the spacecraft. The launch vehicle takes the payload, that is what we really want to achieve, that from the Earth to the defined orbit, and this will be decided by the definition of the mission. It could be a sun-synchronous polar orbit, it could be a GTO, or it could be a parking orbit in preparation for an interplanetary mission. So the major systems of the launch vehicle and this spacecraft are summarized in this slide. So we can see that the first three are related to the electric and electronic systems. And I will start with my own area and my favorite area, that is the navigation, guidance, and control. As we all know, it is like the brain of the system, consists of the sensors, basically the gyros and the accelerometers, which will be mounted at appropriate locations on the space transportation system. And there'll be onboard computers with the navigation, guidance, and control software running, and also the actuators which provide the muscle power to make the vehicle move in the direction we want it to move. For a launch vehicle, depending on which stage we are in, this could be an electrohydraulic or an electromechanical actuator. And also there are secondary injection thrust vector control systems, which really don't have many moving parts. There are engine gimbal control, where the entire engine is gimbaled. This could be also be affected by having a flexible nozzle. It's a flex nozzle control. All these are linear control systems. And there are also non-linear control systems, primarily the on-off control thrusters. So in the case of winged entry vehicles, you have the aerodynamic surfaces like an aircraft. So this is one aspect of one of the major subsystems. And we need to assess the performance and the health of the various systems for two purposes. One is to make sure that things are working fine. And secondly is to enable post-flight analysis after each mission. This is a very, very important thing. Even if a minor glitch is found, which might affect a future mission, it has to be immediately rectified. So in order to enable this, we have the telemetry, tracking, and the telecommand system. Basically, what it does is, it measures the important parameters of all the subsystems and transmits the information to the ground. And there are tracking stations which are provided appropriately so that there is a very good visibility for the entire duration of the mission. In the case of manned mission, humans are involved, so all these requirements are much more stringent. So in addition to ensuring that the critical phases such as the staging are visible, there should be visibility during most of the orbital phase as well, so that uninterrupted communication is possible between the crew and the ground. So this involves systems both on the spacecraft and all the controlling station on Earth, and may also need additional data relay satellites to ensure this uninterrupted communication. So I've covered these three. Now, coming to the propulsion systems, as most of us already know, we could have solid motors or liquid motors or cryogenic engines in a combination which is dictated by the requirement of the mission. When we talk about spacecraft, the propulsion requirements are much less. The bulk of the energy that is required has already been imparted by the launch vehicle. Only if it is an interplanetary mission or an Earth return mission is there a necessity for a significant propulsion system. At the same time, spacecrafts have mission durations of years together. Launch vehicle missions obviously are over within an hour in most cases. So the power requirement is continuous for a spacecraft. So for missions in the vicinity of Earth, this is mostly managed by the solar panels. But as we go farther and farther from the sun, we'll have to look for alternate sources of power. So I thought I'll just tell about the subsystems and then come to the challenges. So I'm now going through to the next slide, which speaks about the various challenges of space exploration. See, here also I have a set here. The first four, that is the transportation technology, the propulsion, the materials and the structures are very, very strongly interlinked. So I'll be explaining this in the next slide. In general, we can say that extremely aggressive operating environment is experienced by all engineering products in space missions. Why? Because first of all, they undergo high mechanical loads during assembly and launch, because the launch environment is having severe acoustic vibration, especially when you are just lifting off. It's extremely high. In space, there could be extreme temperature gradients. Like for example, if you are having a mission to Jupiter, you could be encountering temperatures of minus 200 degrees. If you are looking at the sun, you are talking of temperatures of more than 500 degrees plus. There are, of course, other hazards, which I'll be really dwelling upon in a later slide, like high radiation doses and the effects of vacuum, which could lead to desorption of water, outgassing, condensation. Then hypervelocity impacts. These are some of the space hazards, which I'll be dwelling upon later. And if you are talking of a re-entry mission, then extremely high temperature and atmospheric dynamic pressure during re-entry. And if you are talking about a re-entry vehicle which goes and comes back, because ultimately that is the dream of every aerospace engineer, to make a vehicle that gives you aircraft-like access to space, then this stress is encountered by the engineering products for each and every re-entry. Now, on the energy front, we need to have energy harvesting and storage for long duration missions. Of course, already supercapacitors and regenerative fuel cells are being investigated in a big way. For interplanetary missions, we generally use radioisotope thermoelectric power generator. which generates electricity using the temperature difference between space and the heat expelled by decaying isotopes. Now, in the domain of space structures, the International Space Station and all the other space stations for that matter are made of aluminum alloy. So here there are two problems. One is the weight is high, and to carry it up, you need a launch vehicle of high capability with respect to weight as well as with respect to the envelope, because it is a rigid structure. And we know how the space stations are built up. They are carried up through several launch vehicle missions and then assembled in orbit over a period of years. In fact, the International Space Station took nearly 20 years to get fully assembled. Now, for the future, there are many technologies which can be thought of, like inflatable habitats. These can be carried in stored condition and then deployed. They are lightweight. And here one challenge would be storing the maximum size in a minimum stored volume. Like something like origami is already being explored, so that the volume at least is made as small as possible during the launch phase. Of course, there are other challenges. We need to have leak-proof joints, adhesives like new joining technology, and deployment mechanisms, pressurization mechanisms once they are in orbit, the dynamics of soft structures, how to make sure they retain their shape, and how such soft structures can be protected from space hazards. These are very exciting areas. And obviously, space activities such as orbital assembly would be implemented directly or assisted by remote robotic arms. And for complex missions, high level of automation and robotics are anyway required. Now, in a nutshell, we really need to have a low mass with guaranteed very high performance and reliability for space mission, because we know that there is absolutely no repair or maintenance option once we go away from the vicinity of Earth. And in the case of manned mission, there are human related challenges which are both engineering and medical related. And in the future, when mankind actually plans for extraterrestrial planet settlement missions, there's a logical extension to this, that we will need to use the local resources and also have systematic recycling, local manufacturing and repair. And this only will give you a mission sustainability. So now I will come to the details. I will start with transportation technology. So as I already mentioned, the basic objective is to have the optimum mass. And what is the mass that needs to be taken to orbit? This depends on how many crew you have, what's the duration of your mission, and what is the mission profile. So one typical example would be the Saturn V. It needed to take 3 men to the moon and to bring them back, and the mission duration was a week. And so how big was the rocket needed? It was the largest rocket that has ever been built. I mean, even now it is the largest rocket. Of course, one Starship comes up along with Super Heavy. At that point of time, it will be bigger than Saturn V. But so far, it continues to the biggest ever. So I have given here two pictures. See, one is that of a rocket and another is that of a commercial aircraft. And I would like to compare the two. So basically, I'll be comparing with respect to the payload fraction. And what's the payload fraction? It is the measure of the useful mass. So there's a nice pie chart here. So you can see that the highest proportion of the mass of the rocket consists of the propellant. So in this case, the propellant has two parts, the fuel and the oxidizer. Now, this huge propellant also needs to be encased by the structure. So another significant chunk comes from the structure. So what is left for the payload, that is the usual mass, the useful mass, it is very less. It is in fact less than 1% of the total mass that you are actually taking up. So this naturally translates to high cost per kg of payload. Now let us look at the aircraft. Of course, we have to keep in mind some basic differences. One is the aircraft normally flies within the atmosphere. Its altitude is normally not more than 10 kilometers. A rocket has to provide energy, enough energy to gain orbital velocity from the Earth. Now, and also an aircraft not normally, it doesn't need to carry oxidizer at all. So its propellant is restricted to the fuel. So if you are looking at the pie chart, you can see that in a aircraft, a very significant chunk is the useful payload. And there's another factor which drives down the cost, that is the aircraft is obviously reused hundreds of times. So this also drives down the cost in a very significant way. So basically right now what we have are chemical rockets, and chemical rockets capability is limited by two things. You may please recall what I was saying in the previous slide. It is basically limited by propulsion and structures. So suppose you really want to get a large payload to space. And why would you need to get a large payload to space? Because you are looking for missions, ambitious missions. You are looking for at a later stage, direct missions beyond Mars. We are looking for Earth return missions, and we want to send humans to space, all of which entails high payload weight and also volume. So we need to have a methodology to get large payloads to space. Of course, there are two ways of doing this. How do you get a large payload to space? Current best solution is one of the two. One is either to have a huge rocket or to take up the parts by multiple rocket launches and assemble in space like ISS. So these are the only two options which are available to us right now. And obviously what we'll be doing is we'll try to extract the maximum juice out of the rockets which we have by optimally designing the subsystems and also by optimal mission planning. But in the future, we will need major technological breakthroughs. Before that, I would like to mention that this approach, that having a modest rocket but extracting the maximum juice out of it, is what was the approach which enabled us to reach Mars and Moon with a very modest polar satellite launch vehicle. I'll dwell more upon it in the mission planning slide. What we need are breakthrough in materials and propellants if you really want to have aircraft-like access to space. So if you have high energy propellants, like if you have a propellant whose energy per kg of propellant is really high, then the propellant mass will come down. Once the propellant mass comes down, the proportion of the pi of the propellant comes down, and then the structural mass to encase it will also come down consequently. If you have an air-breathing propulsion system, then you need not carry oxidizer. Then this proportion comes down even further. Design for reusability will drive down the cost, and these breakthroughs are necessary in the future. And later on, you may not need to carry everything which you need for a deep space mission. You may be having stops in between. You can go for in situ resource mining, and you can make parts through 3D printing. So it will bring down the mass we need to carry from Earth. So I just wanted to give a sense of the challenges which are involved. And these are the challenges which have really prevented us from moving far beyond the vicinity of the Earth till now. Okay, now I am coming to the mission area. So generally, when we talk about mission, what is the objective of the mission? The main mission objective is to maximize performance. But if a human is involved, if you are sending up a human, then your objective totally changes. Your objective becomes to maximize safety. So normal trajectory shaping is to optimize performance. If a human is involved, the trajectory shaping itself is to minimize the load and the acceleration which are encountered by the live human who is sitting inside. There's also one more requirement, the ability to safely abort if a need arises. Now we know that there are two very critical phases of the mission. One is the ascent through the atmosphere and the return through the atmosphere. In fact, these are the two very, very critical parts of the mission. If you are really going to another planet, then there's one more very critical phase, that is the orbital insertion. If you are not able to do that properly, your entire mission is out. Now, during the ascent trajectory, the main consideration is the aerodynamic loads, which are encountered by the vehicle. Whereas during return from orbit, it is a different ball game altogether. You are already having high energy. You have to dissipate this high energy so that the final touchdown is soft and at the designated area. Now, what happens as you enter atmosphere? Thermal loads as well as structural loads, they start increasing. You may recall the very tragic Columbia disaster in this regard. So at high altitudes, you have a very limited entry corridor. It is basically limited by the heat flux. We need to enter at the right angle of attack. So what we do, we select the appropriate deboost point in the orbit and carry out the maneuvers which are required to ensure safe re-entry. Now, if you have too shallow an entry trajectory, what will happen? The aircraft will simply skip back into the cold of space. It is like a pebble which children skip over the water in a pond. If you throw it at the right angle, the pebble will skip all the way across the water. What will happen if your angle is not right? It simply sinks. Same thing will happen to a entry vehicle. If you have too steep an entry, the craft may burn up in the atmosphere because of excessive heating. Really speaking, an entry mission is like a fine dance on the rim between fire and ice. Now coming to interplanetary missions, I'm very proud of the missions which our very modest PSLV could achieve. It was originally designed for orbits around Earth. It could successfully put satellites in orbit around the Moon and the Mars by judicious mission planning. So what is shown here, the first one, of course, you can make out that it is the Moon mission. And the second one I'm using to illustrate how a mission planning is done. I'll make it as simple as possible. See, initially what happens? The spacecraft will be orbiting Earth. So it will primarily be under the gravitational pull of the Earth. So its motion will be governed by two bodies. One is its own body, that is a satellite, and the other is the Earth. Now, as it moves further, it moves away from Earth, then it comes under the influence of the Sun. So basically it goes into a heliocentric orbit where it is influenced by the Sun. It goes on its journey. It comes close to the destination here, which is the Mars. So it gets captured by Mars. So initially the Earth will be influencing the spacecraft most, then the Sun will be influencing, and then Mars will be influencing. So basically the mission is analyzed by splitting it into a sequence of two body problems. So for this problem, where only two bodies are involved, there is a simple solution which Newton has given. So this approach is normally called the patched conic approximation. It is very widely used in mission planning. This is the conventional mission planning. Now let us think of going beyond Mars. Now the first one which comes to mind of when we think about mission beyond Mars, it is a very, very successful Voyager mission. It has resulted in several discoveries in the outer solar system and is now continuing as the Voyager interstellar mission. Voyager 2 here, Voyager 1 here, and before that we had the Pioneers. The Pioneer 10 here, the Pioneer 11 here. So just now I was saying that, okay, if you have a small rocket, it's very difficult. You cannot go beyond Mars. How could Voyager achieve this? This was because there was a very special celestial event. Such events are very few and far between and normally occur. This particular event occurs only once in 175 years. So if you look carefully, you can see, I'll just trace Voyager 2. Okay, Voyager 2, you can see this is the Mars orbit, this is the Jupiter orbit, this is the Saturn orbit. So it is, Jupiter is in the vicinity, so it gets gravity assist from Jupiter. It comes to Saturn, Saturn is in the vicinity at that time, it gets gravity assist from Saturn. It comes to Saturn. Uranus is also there. Then Neptune is also where it needs to be. So this is an alignment, it is a celestial alignment which enabled gravity assist. But this is not always possible. We obviously cannot wait like that. So we should have a strategy. So how can we have? What kind of strategies could we have? In general, it is very difficult to send large spacecraft to the outer reaches of the solar system through classical mission design. It is simple and elegant, but it is fuel intensive. So how can we wonder about the solar system? It so happens that there are hidden low energy pathways in the solar system which we can make use of. I would like to explain how this is possible. Now, let us consider again a satellite in Earth orbit. And with this satellite, you want to observe the sun. Now, this time, let us broaden our viewpoint and consider not just the Earth and the satellite. Let us also consider the sun. That means there are 3 bodies now. So, for a 3-body system, there are some very interesting mathematical properties. These are useful for designing fuel-efficient missions. So, you have a rotating coordinate frame with these 3 bodies. We get 5 special regions in space. If a spacecraft is placed in one of these 5 regions with sufficient velocity, it will appear to be stationary with respect to the 2 heavenly bodies. So 3 bodies, one is the spacecraft itself, and the other 2 are, in this case, the Earth and the Sun. It will be basically stationary with respect to the Earth and the Sun. Once it is there, then you don't need much fuel to keep it there. Actually, these regions were discovered by an 18th century mathematician. His name is very familiar to all of us engineers. It was Lagrange, and he discovered all 5 of them. Of course, Euler also discovered 3 of them. Now, the behavior around these points is actually chaotic, and that's also a plus point. What is a chaotic trajectory? A small change in position or speed will result in a large change in the trajectory. So basically, these pathways will form tubes or manifolds going towards the Lagrange points, and they go away from the Lagrange points. They can be used for very efficient space travel with very little propulsive energy. The spacecraft can be directed from one destination to the other in a very fuel efficient but possibly slow manner, which means it is not really very good for human spaceflight. It's good for everything else, which I'll come to a little later. See, I wanted to spend a little bit of your time on this spacecraft. It is like a saga, real saga. I've spoken about this earlier. It is the ISEE. It started off as ISEE. It is the Sun-Earth Observer. And you just look at the timelines. In my batch, we were in pre-degree in 1978. So at that time, this ISEE was launched and it was aiming for the Sun-Earth Lagrange point. So by 1982, it finished its mission. That was its original planned mission. Almost all its fuel was left. Everything was exhausted. So then what they did, they tapped these low energy pathways and it was maneuvered to the tail of a comet. That is one comet. 1986, it again explored another comet, that is Halley's Comet, and then it continued till 1997, and its payloads were still working at that time. It was intentionally shut down. Then its story really does not end there, and in 2014, some communication could be re-established with this spacecraft, and where it is could be ascertained, and we now know that it will come back to Earth in 2031. So 5 of its science experiments were still working in 2014. Just imagine. So So it's right now in heliocentric orbit. Of course, later on, there were many missions which were designed keeping in mind these trajectories. That is, Genesis Solar Wind Sample Return Mission also relied on low thrust trajectories for interplanetary exploration. Okay, now I'll come to the propulsion. We know that all our conventional propulsions are generally hazardous. They are really not very good for man-rated systems. And even otherwise, the future lies in non-conventional propellants and a host of advanced propulsion technologies. Now, when we consider interplanetary missions, chemical rockets are very slow. Even the next generation chemical rockets are too slow for human travel to asteroid belt and beyond, because we'll need more than 5 years to reach the moons of Jupiter. That's just one way. And so plasma rockets are the rockets of choice for the outer solar system. They can reduce the total fuel usage in space by 90%. And also the nuclear fusion engines, they give very high specific impulse, but these are all really next generation engines. But for transportation of cargo, we can definitely use the low energy pathways, which I have just mentioned, so that the energy required is very less. So this approach can actually be used for science missions to reach deep space destinations near Earth asteroids, commercial missions for placing, servicing, resupply, repositioning, and salvaging space assets, to spiral payloads to high energy orbits, which includes, of course, the L1 point, because initially the challenge is to make it reach that point. Because these Lagrange points are potential assembly points in space, so that they are very attractive. And now solar propulsion, solar sail propulsion is also very attractive. It is a low thrust orbit transfer. Acceleration is very slow, very low, but it is a constant acceleration. If you give a constant low acceleration for years together, you can imagine the speeds which can ultimately be attained. And ion propulsion is also extremely efficient, and it's the main propulsion for deep space probes. Can give delta V's as high as 90 km per second. Actually, this is 10 times higher than what is achievable by chemical propulsion. I just touch upon the materials and structures for completeness sake and go. We know that the thrusters and systems need to work flawlessly for years together. Materials should not degrade. They have to be tough to space environment, have to be impact resistant, damage tolerant, and also we have to think of a human inside a confined cabin environment where condensation of moisture, bacterial growth on surfaces, especially in space toilets, could prove a real problem. So there are things like hydrophobic coatings, biofilm resistant coatings. These all would have immense spin-off potentials on Earth as well, especially in the hygiene industry. And of course, we know that 3D printing is being widely practiced on Earth. It would have benefits for long duration space flight because parts can be printed in orbit itself for repair and replacement. You don't have to carry everything from Earth. And innovative structures are also the domain of the future because they will lead to substantial reduction in mass. Due to paucity of time, I'm not dwelling on any of those. So I've just tried to convey the major avionics systems through this simplified block diagram. Entire avionics is characterized by robustness, redundancy, and fault tolerance. And radiation hardened components are often used in spacecrafts for reasons which I will come to in a couple of slides. And definitely we need to have a lot of intelligence on board, especially if you are far away from the Earth. Why? Because if we need to send commands or software updates, or you need to track location and receive images and scientific data, you need to have reliable communication with the spacecraft. That is paramount to mission success. So you just look at the distances involved. You can see where Voyager is now. I have to confess that this update is some 6 months old. And at the speed at which it is traveling, it would probably have added another 0. It's so far away from Earth. but still we could give a software update. It is something really amazing. I think a couple of months back, one of the voyages had a problem. And from Earth, we could intervene and correct it. And look at the latency. The round trip time of light is more than 1.2 days for light just to go and come back. So that's the kind of numbers we are talking about. And of course, there are other challenges. Challenges are for both the spacecraft and also the receiving ground station. Right. I thought I will just touch upon the space hazards. So we all know that space environment is hostile. So what is this hostility due to? Of course, we know extremes of temperature, radiation, vacuum, and also the danger of impact with micrometeorite or a orbital debris. So on the left side, I'm having the radiation mapping here. There are basically three kinds of radiation. You could have particles trapped in the Earth's magnetic field, particles which are shot out in space during solar flares. These are like events which happen once in a while, and galactic cosmic rays which are prevalent everywhere. So on Earth, we are well protected. Our magnetosphere reflects most of the solar particles. Atmosphere also will quell most of the particles which come through. Now in space, the sensitivity of electronics to the space radiation environment and its effects, especially single event upsets, is a concern present for all spacecraft. And it obviously poses risks for humans also. Cumulative effects of low intensity, long duration radiation exposure on the human body could cause cell damage, adversely affect the immune system, can cause metabolic disorders, and of course, even cancer. Now, in the case of short duration missions, exposure to low intensity radiation is not much of a concern. We only have to cater to intense and energetic solar events. Now, these could be actually avoided for a short mission by accurately predicting when it's likely to happen and by avoiding the mission in that time period. Now, for longer missions, this is obviously not an option. And if you are going beyond low Earth orbit, then your protection from the Earth is totally out. So the danger of highly energetic galactic cosmic rays is also there. So what is needed is accurate space weather modeling, prediction, and monitoring techniques are very important in this regard. And of course, we need to have mitigation techniques also over the entire mission period. If humans are involved, we will have to give them something which will mitigate this effect. Like there are nutraceuticals which can be taken into the body to avoid or at least to reduce this damage. And the other protective mechanisms which are also inbuilt. The other threat is the space debris. And we know that nearly 500,000 objects are orbiting the Earth, which includes a large number of dead satellites with orbital velocities of more than 9 km per second. So even a small particle can inflict large damage. So how do we mitigate this during launch? During launch, all the bigger items are catalogued. We know when they will come over the launch trajectory. So this is taken care by adjusting the window of the launch. That's how sometimes we hear that the launch is postponed by 2 minutes, 3 minutes. That is to take care of this so that it will not come and impact. Later on, in Earth orbit also, all the catalog pieces movements are known. So we will have commanded maneuvering of the spacecraft to avoid danger. For small pieces, of course, there is mechanical covering, which will, like Whipple shield, which will protect against small pieces. But you go beyond Earth orbit, you are really not much threatened by orbital debris. But then what happens? Micrometeoroids could be there. And the risk there is that they may not be so well mapped as the debris surrounding Earth. This could pose a risk for long distance mission, including human exploration of Mars in the future. So I'll come to my last slide, which is the additional engineering challenges for human spaceflight. See, when humans are there, there are human-centric engineering systems which are required. I've just summarized them in this slide. First of all, as we all know, it's just common sense. A system which enables humans to survive and function effectively in space environment is needed. For short missions, we can carry along everything we need. We can carry air, water, food, everything. Long duration missions, it is not possible. What does ISS do? ISS is in the vicinity of the Earth. You have regular resupply missions. And you know that human beings are prolific waste generators. We breathe, we sweat, we generate all sorts of waste products. It can vitiate the atmosphere inside the cabin also. So we need to have environmental control and life support systems, which provides and controls the atmospheric pressure, then the correct balance of oxygen and other components of air, fire detection and suppression, waste management, and water. And also we have to monitor the crew's health. So there has to be some wearable monitoring devices and equipment to counteract the effects of microgravity. We know about the spacesuit. What is a spacesuit? Spacesuit is actually a mini spacecraft. It is without a spacesuit, there is no possibility of carrying out an extravehicular activity. But even within the cabin, normally spacesuits are worn as a precautionary measure, especially during launch and re-entry. This last aspect, this I put here, ergonomics. We know that human body undergoes a lot of changes in gravity. The body's natural shape itself is changed. It's a bend shape. So everything which is inside the home of the astronauts, that is interior layout, has to account for this. So the position of the display system, the controls, everything, because even your eye position, your gaze position itself changes when you are in orbit. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the overall challenges which are there. And many of these challenges, when we overcome them, naturally they give spin-off benefits here on Earth. So I hope I have not exceeded the time. I think maybe I've exceeded by 5 minutes. So I've come to the end of my presentation. This was a bird's eye view. Thank you for your patient listening. I would be happy to take any questions if they are there. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for enlightening us with your talk. There are few questions in the chat box. May I read out to you?
Yes, please.
First question makes me think about the movie Interstellar actually. So first question is, will we humans from Earth really form colonies on a different planet? The question is from Shanti ma'am.
Okay. Shanti, no?
Yes.
So really, you know very well that unless we dream and think big, nothing will happen. So now you know that some people are really thinking big. They are talking of going and settling in Mars. But to settle in Mars, if you ask me, it may take a long time. The terraforming and all will take, thousands of years in my own personal assessment. But there are other ways in which you can do it. Moon would probably be a more easier and short-term proposition. Why I will tell you, because Moon has a lot of lava tubes which are being explored to see whether they can sustain human beings. I mean, you can go inside, you can make a shelter within which you can have everything which you need, like a regenerative life support system. And Moon is close to Earth, so you can have resupply. So everything is possible. In my own personal perception, it is much easier to colonize Moon than it is to colonize Mars. It will happen, but when it will happen is a question. There may be trips going and coming, but even now, going to Mars is, I think it's a proportion of 6 months, and then coming back, and you have to spend some time there. So it's a question of psychological adaptation as well as all the other resource constraints. It will be in the future. I do not think it will. Okay, it may happen in our lifetime also, but we'll be quite old. That's what I feel.
Thank you, Ambika. Great answer. Thank you.
Okay, next question is how space debris can be reduced and the can be used to reduce this debris.
That is the very relevant question right now. There are two things which are already being done. One is, we know that when a rocket takes a payload to orbit, the final stage of the rocket also attains the same velocity as the spacecraft. So earlier practice used to be to leave it in orbit. So it will add to one more debris. So for every rocket, every spacecraft or every mission, you have one unwanted debris. So now what is happening is that is no longer allowed. So the final stage will, it will deorbit, it will burn up. That's one option. That is if you are in low Earth orbit or in a medium Earth orbit where you can come back and plunge into the atmosphere. But if you are really in GTO, then GSO is 36,000 kilometers up. So that option will be extremely energy intensive. So there's something called a graveyard orbit. So all the spent stages go and be there. But that also is not a long-term solution. So in the long term, many entrepreneurs are trying to see whether there's anything they can do to salvage these space assets. See, suppose a spent satellite is refueled. It may have no other problem. It may only have finished its fuel. If you refuel it, it gets a new lease of life. Secondly, if there are debris, if there is something which can go and capture the debris and attach a sail onto the debris so that it increases its aerodynamic drag, just pushes it down, then it may undergo a large number of decaying orbits and finally burn up. Now, there are so many. In fact, this is one of the very challenging areas in which a lot of research and some experimentation is going on currently. Because we need to do something. Otherwise, we are going and spoiling the way we have spoiled Earth. We are spoiling our atmosphere around Earth also. We cannot do that. There are many ways in which it can be done. I've just given one or two. There's one more. Let me just say, there's one new, very interesting concept of design for demisability. You know what demisability is? It is designed to die. The human body is designed like that, Once a human body dies, what happens? This is zero waste. Everything decays and is converted into useful products. So in the realm of mechanical engineering, they are thinking of design for demisability. So at the end of useful life, it will convert into some other products. This is not for in space. It will be if you are going to some other planet. You should be able to cannibalize what has gone there and use it for some other purpose. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Next question, ma'am. It is, where do we stand in the current human spaceflight mission?
I am giving a general talk, so I'm really not talking about my own domain of work. I'm sorry. Anyway, we are working towards it.
Okay, ma'am. Yeah. Then, are there plans of initiating civilian spaceflight missions and space tourism in next 5 to 10 years?
The world over, I can only talk about in a general way. You must be knowing that there are many private space players who are eyeing the space tourism market in a big way, because humans are willing to pay. Some are willing to pay to have their dedicated mission to moon. Would have read. There's a billionaire who's looking for co-passengers, companions to accompany him, and many are interested in just undergoing a suborbital flight so that they can go up and see how Earth looks from space. Because whoever has seen it, they say it is like an epiphany. You go up and then you realize, why are we fighting here for small things? Earth is one whole. Like I think Buzz Aldrin, he had an extremely spiritual experience. It's not just him, many have had. So people are really interested in space tourism, and a lot of entrepreneurs are coming forward to tap the potential of that market.
Okay, ma'am. So next question is, what are the arrangements required when ISEE is coming back in 2031?
ISEE will be just coming back, We will not be able to, it will not come and plunge into the Earth. It will be like saying hello to us and go away. So probably what will be done is, there will be an attempt to reinitiate communication with it. What happened was, earlier it was far away. So 2014, when they initiated communication, they could establish, but then after some time, it was lost. So when it comes back, probably, because for each space mission, there is a dedicated team on Earth, which cannot be indefinitely kept unless there is a continuing scientific outcome from the mission. So this was a mission which was written off decades back, but there's still interest because we need to know what's happening. Will our electronics and science experiments survive for such a long period? So definitely, I'm not sure what is planned, but I know, knowing human nature, they'll definitely try to establish communication and see whether it's still working. They'll do it. This is my personal feeling. I've not read anywhere what they're planning to do.
Okay, ma'am. Next question is materials developed in space research that have found their way into common use, especially from ISRO.
I can give you one example. I'll give you one example. Of course, there are many, like even for the Jaipur foot, the lightweight composites, there is a contribution from ISRO. Because we also need, for us, weight is a premium. We have to be, everything has to be lightweight, high strength material. And that naturally has a corollary in prosthetics, because anybody who is carrying an artificial foot doesn't want to lug around a huge weight. That's one thing. Then the fire retardant coatings. Fire is a hazard which we want to avoid. A lot of fire retardant coatings are developed. They have a lot of commercial use as well. I've just given 2 examples. There are many.
Okay, ma'am. So, can you also talk about rocket-propelled passenger aircrafts?
Rocket-propelled passenger aircrafts. See, a lot of research is going on in air-breathing propulsion. So you have scramjets, ramjets, and a rocket engine. Suppose you have a transport vehicle which is having rocket propulsion plus air breathing. Initially, you will definitely have to use rockets because scramjet and ramjet will work only for a definite range of dynamic pressure and only a range of conditions. So everything will need to have a rocket assist. And I understand that there is a plan that Starship is also planned to have, it will ultimately doing some intercontinental transportation as well. So that could be a rocket propelled aircraft. That will be the most immediate. For the future, we will need to have single stage to orbit kind of structures where a lot of breakthroughs are required. We will see it happening in the immediate future. But Starship has plans. Maybe that will come under this definition.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
For engaging with your talk. It was great from you. You found time for us during your busy schedule. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So now I invite Professor B.S. Manoj from Indian Institute of Space Science and Technology for vote of thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good evening. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. V.R. Lalitambika, distinguished scientist from ISRO. It was an excellent talk. It was a very comprehensive talk. You touched upon the highly interdisciplinary nature of space research. You also have very clearly elaborated on the payload restrictions of even the largest rockets of the world, the cost per kg of rockets. You have given a very comprehensive idea about the mission planning, safety aspect, particularly the space mission design beyond Mars and other planets. Very interesting examples of gravity assist by celestial alignment, as well as the use of chaotic control mechanisms for very advanced missions. So you covered a brief about the propulsion techniques, technologies, including chemical, non-chemical, and very advanced technologies such as beamed energy-based propulsion, as well as antimatter-related propulsion technologies. You have also touched upon the avionics reliability as well as robustness-related issues, especially in deep space missions where the round-trip latency or even one-way latency is on the order of days. That is very interesting and very enlightening talk. We express our gratitude and thankfulness for having agreed to deliver this lecture and spared your valuable time for that. Thank you, madam.
Thank you.
We would like to express our thankfulness to Shanti Devendran, Madam Lilidambika's friend and childhood as well as school friend. Who came and delivered a warm welcome to the audience here. We are glad that you revealed some secrets about the cat woman. Thank you, madam. And Harindra Lal sir was the backbone of this event. Actually, he takes a lot of effort, lot of interest, a lot of passion to make sure this highly popular inter-society webinar series is a very successful activity. I'm very thankful for you on behalf of IEEE Institute of Engineers and other societies jointly organizing this event, including IEEE EMBS. Thank you, sir. And we have a lot of distinguished people among our audience. I'm unable to call every one of you, but I have been seeing S.C.K. Nair, Ebenezer Rajkumar, Dr. Ravendranath, Dr. Rajesh Joseph Abraham, and sorry that I cannot call every one of you, Murli Mohanlal sir, Janardhanan, and a few more I will be able to call out, Padmanabh Iyer sir, and so many of the distinguished members of IEEE, Institute of Engineers, and other societies who organize this particular event. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating in this interaction with the speaker and the IEEE volunteers who actually set out behind the scenes to make this a successful event. All IEEE volunteers, IE volunteers, and IEST student branch volunteers, Elizabeth George, Radhika, Gobika Regunathan, and Gita Fatima. Thank you all for helping organize this. And anybody else I missed here, I thank you for coming here. And I would like to remind you that this is a ongoing series. This is a very highly successful series with speakers from all around the world come here and share their experiences and expertise. Thank you for listening, and over to you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Before we wind up the session, let me talk about the next weekly webinar series. It is scheduled on 17th March, Wednesday, same time, 6 p.m.